Hi, everybody. Welcome back to The Reason We Learn. I'm Deb Fellman, mom, homeschooler, educator. I want to talk today about politics in the public schools and why they really don't mix. They're not good for kids. I mean, I don't think the government should be involved in education to the degree it is in the first place. I could make a whole video on that subject alone, but this video today is going to be about a specific op-ed to CNN and the lies in this letter, and why I think it's a great example of why having the government run our schools and having unions, which is sort of like a government within the government, run schools is just bad for kids. It's bad for kids because adults lie and adults use them as pawns. They use them as pawns to gain and keep power. And they play on our emotions as parents and as caring adults when they do it. And I think it is evil. I think that's just a terrible thing to do because these kids are counting on us. And this is not how you give them an education. So this letter says, to the next U.S. Secretary of Education, it's time to focus on students, by Miguel Cervantes del Toro. He's a principal of an elementary school in Baltimore. Now, obviously, implicit in this headline is that our current U.S. Secretary of Education is not focused on students, which I think he does not make a case for, but let's leave that aside. I'm not going to read the whole letter. I'm going to skip past large chunks of it because he goes through this whole, identity politics, blah, blah, blah. He's Mexican immigrant. He even tosses in the term Latinx, which I know that actually many Latinos do not like because it's grammatically incorrect in Spanish, and it's cultural appropriation of the social justice movement, culturally appropriating Spanish for their own purposes. But I want to get down to the part where the lies begin, okay? Now, he talks about remote learning, right? Which I have complaints about, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But here's what he says that is a lie, okay? He says, not only has the federal government not allocated any relief funding to closing the digital divide for students during this pandemic. That's one lie. But Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, citing economic turmoil resulting from COVID-19, recently vetoed bills that would have provided much-needed resources for schools like mine. Now, why? I'm making a claim, like he made a claim. There was no funding to close the digital divide. He's very clever there to say to closing the digital divide when, in fact, money is money and funding can be used for whatever they deemed necessary, right? I mean, in theory, if you appropriated funds and said, here, Baltimore schools, here's some money to deal with whatever problems you need to deal with, they could spend them on digital divide. They could spend them on books. They could spend them on spend it on teachers. Usually, the federal government doesn't get down to the nitty gritty of saying you must use this to buy Chromebooks or you must use it. No, they give you money and you do with it what you see fit, provided you actually do something with it. So let's take a look at what the no allocation of funding looked like, shall we? There's a little thing called the CARES Act. Maybe some of you remember it. Well, part of the CARES Act was the Education Stabilization Fund. Yeah. Part of the $2.2 trillion that we don't have. Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities, CARES Act. The Education Stabilization Fund, ESF, allotted $30.75 billion with a B to the U.S. Department of Education to award grants to state SEAs and district LEAs and institutions of higher education, IHEs, in response to COVID-19. Okay, major components of it, $13.2 billion, ESSER, elementary and secondary school emergency relief. These were grants to be awarded to local educational agencies to address the impact on elementary and secondary schools across the nation. The impact. Digital divides or not digital divides, just impact. $13.2 billion. $3 billion government emergency education relief. ED awarded GEER grant funds to states' governor's offices. States decided how to award funds within their state to best meet the needs of students, schools, post-secondary institutions, and other educational organizations affected by COVID-19. And then $14 billion for higher education. But just for Mr. Cervantes del Toro, $13.2 billion elementary and secondary. Okay, this is nationwide. So here we have this little map. Let's take a look at the map and let's go down to Maryland, shall we? How much money did Maryland spend? Oh, that's surprising. 30.4% of the money that was allotted to them. 30.4%. Yeah. So here's how much was awarded. $207,834,058 for Maryland. How much has been spent? $5,642,296. So I'm thinking, I don't know, I could be wrong. I mean, that's 2.7% of what they could be spent. So, I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think that the fault lies with Betsy DeVos. I think this is a lie. I think I'm on pretty solid ground that he's lying, that the current Secretary of Education and the federal government, made sure that Maryland had plenty of money. Now, let's go to the allegation about Governor Hogan. What did Hogan veto? These bills, which, by the way, they have the votes in their legislature to overturn his vetoes if they wanted to. But I think he did the responsible thing in vetoing them. Why do I think that? Well, let's take a look, shall we? First of all, let's remember how much money they haven't spent that they do have. They have money, okay? So now let's look at what he vetoed. What he vetoed was essentially, if you want to get right down to it, a giant tax hike on the people of Maryland in the middle of a time period where maybe 30% of their small businesses are shut down. And it would mostly come in the form of sales taxes and taxes on downloads and things of that nature when people are stuck at home and downloading plenty of things. So we're going to tax people who are already hurting, who have seen their income and their livelihoods disappear in many cases. And we're going to call it education funding, even though we have a giant pot of money we haven't spent. And then we're going to hold the Republican governor accountable for vetoing what's essentially a tax hike. Okay? So here's what it says. And they have a supermajority, so they can veto it. If they passed it, he vetoed, they're going to come back and overturn his veto, I'm sure. The bill would have implemented new education formulas recommended by the so-called Kirwan Commission and required $3.8 billion in additional public education funding by 2030. During a 10-year ramp-up period, the reforms would have an overall cost to the state and local jurisdictions of $32 billion. Now, I grant you, they weren't given billions. They were given hundreds of millions. That's fine. But this was supposed to deal with COVID. And he's connecting these two things. He's connecting it like, oh, woe is us, COVID. The federal government do anything, and Larry Hogan vetoed these bills. Well, yes, he did. But this isn't to do with COVID. This is education reform in general. And maybe there is a good faith disagreement that he has that this is a funding issue. Maybe not. I don't know. But at this time, to pass this right now, would be detrimental to the overall economy of the state and certainly to the bottom lines of individual households throughout the state. And he says, due to the early and unprecedented actions, he's talking about they save lives, et cetera. Okay. And then he's talking about how the State Board of Revenue estimates Maryland will lose $2.8 billion, including nearly $1 billion in income tax revenue in just 3 months because of the coronavirus. Hogan said the loss represents a 50% decrease in revenue for the 90-day period and amounts to 15% of the state's general fund for fiscal 2020. He implemented a budget freeze, instructed all agencies to stop discretionary purchases unrelated to addressing COVID. That sounds responsible to me. And directed the Department of Budget and Management to make recommendations for further budget cuts. And now, Cheryl Bost, president of the Maryland State Education Association, said in a statement, the governor's veto is a disappointing but hopefully temporary setback, because sure, they're going to override it. Now more than ever, we need this to create strong schools in every neighborhood. They're not even getting the kids into the schools, guys. They're not even in the schools. It seems to me the first thing you have to do to have strong schools is actually have your students in the schools. Everybody, including now Fauci. Thank you, Fauci, for actually echoing everything that the president has said for the past, 5 months or so. Thank you for finally agreeing that there's very little risk to opening the schools. We need to get the kids back in the schools so they actually can learn something. Before we start talking about all this reform and raising taxes and so forth, they wanted to pass a package of bills that would have raised revenue for the state. The bills include new tax on digital downloads and another that would have created a tax on digital advertising, which is how most businesses advertise, even small businesses. The tax on digital downloads would apply Maryland's 6% sales and use tax to digital services, music, ebooks, video streaming services, a lot of which, again, people stuck at home are using so they can remain sane. Advertisers with more than $100 million in gross revenue are subject to the tax. Let's just drive business right out. We're not going to advertise. We're not going to have business going on there at all. I mean, when you have a giant pot of money sitting around not being spent on education and the kids are not in school, and you want to come and say, let's have a tax hike in the middle of a pandemic when people are out of work, I call that using kids as a prop for power. And here's what I want you to have in your mind as you're thinking of all this. And this does seem like a strange thing to throw into the middle of a discussion about funding, but let's take a look at why the virtual schooling is so bad and why we need to get these kids, these at-risk kids, back into the schools. Let's look at the cone of learning. This is Edgar Dale, and this was actually published in 1969, but it's relevant here. Here's what we remember after 2 weeks. And this is people. Okay, this is anyone learning anything. Now, talk about a young child. Talk about a young child in a house that's probably stressed out by economic hardship, by fear of getting sick. Maybe they've had a loved one get sick. They see people wearing masks all the time. They can't hang out with their kids, or their friends, rather. There's all kinds of things that they are dealing with that are unusual. They have to learn new information. And in many cases, when you're learning English as your second language, that's even harder. Okay, here's what we remember. 90%, we remember 90% of what we say and do. So doing any kind of dramatic presentation, simulating a real life experience, doing the real thing, like hands-on, tangible learning. Okay. We remember 70% of what we say. So if we have a discussion with a teacher or with our peers, we only remember 50% of what we hear and see. It's passive. It's visual receiving. So that would be watching a movie, looking at an exhibit, watching a demonstration, seeing it done on location. Now imagine it's just black and white flat on a screen, or your teacher is talking flat on a screen. You've got distractions going on, mom, dad, pets, people coming in and out, siblings, noises outside, whatever, ads popping up. Who knows what's going on? Internet that doesn't work all that well. We only remember 20% of what we hear. That's it. So if the visuals aren't that stimulating, if you're just sitting in a Zoom presentation and the teacher's like, wah, 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 and you have to just get it from hearing, there's not something to watch, there's not something to remember visually, and many young learners in particular are visual learners, we're only going to remember 20% of that. Now, reading. There have been studies done, and I mentioned them on this channel before, about how even adults who read well don't remember as well what they read on a screen because we have a tendency to scroll and skim. It's just something that we do. I'm not sure if it's the light that hurts the eyes. I'm not sure if it's just the ability to scroll the page as opposed to having to have the whole page in front of you at one time until you're done with it. Whatever it is, but we tend to scroll and we tend to skim. Kids are no different. So 10% they're going to remember what they read. And that's assuming they read well to begin with. And I want you to remember this. I want you to have a mental picture of this, print it out or take a photo of it or whatever. And I want this to motivate you to push back on your own school districts, school boards, teachers, etc. I'm tutoring now. I'm tutoring kids who are in virtual school, but then they go to a online tutoring service because they need help because they're not succeeding in school. Failures are up in some places up to 60% in Fairfax County, I believe, in Virginia. So I'm having kids with the parents writing, teacher says no tutors needed, but I think there is because the grade's down, blah, 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 a huge amount or whatever. Teachers saying no tutor needed. Why would the teacher say that? Why wouldn't the teacher want all the help they could get? The next thing is the things that I'm seeing the kids struggle with is this. They're plenty smart. They did well before the pandemic, and now learning this way is not working for them. Maybe 10 to 15% of kids can continue to do well in this type of environment. It's a tiny percentage, and the younger you get, the tinier the percentage gets. High school and college age kids can handle this a lot better than your middle school, elementary school kids. And when you get down to kindergarten, first grade, I get requests every day from elementary school parents begging for tutors. And to be perfectly honest with you, some of it is outside my skill set. And I was an elementary school teacher because some of these kids need what amounts to special ed. Some of them need English as a second language on top of learning the material. And I'm not trained for that. I'm trained for ESL alone, but not ESL and all these subjects. So even I can't give them everything they need, but the school district can. Those professionals work for the school district, and these kids deserve to be in the schools. So when I come across an article like this, that talks about the federal government didn't do anything and the next Secretary of Education better do something. When then I see this kind of money sitting around not getting used, I get a little twitchy, I get a little angry. Yeah, the protective maternal teacher in me, whatever, all that comes out, and I get pissed off because these children deserve an education, and they deserve to have adults stop playing games with that. Stop it. Cut it out. There's money. Go get it. Go spend it now, today. Stop worrying about the sales tax you want to have and over the next till 2030, and we want to improve this and improve that. How about you do what the kids need today? These kids are not lab rats, and they're not a science experiment. They're human beings. And it's been determined, scientific research, you love science, it shows that these kids can go to school safely, especially the elementary school kids. So, Mr. Cervantes de la Toro, little handsome face, probably want to be a politician someday. Why don't you go find out where the money is that your district isn't spending? Why don't you give a call over to the union? It probably wants to, argue for more pay or something, and they want to pretend this money isn't there. Why don't you do your freaking job and take care of your kids and stop worrying about what Betsy DeVos did or didn't do? Stop worrying about what Biden's new appointee is going to do, and worry about your kids today and leave the politics out of it. Thank you. I feel much better now. So that's what I had to say today, and thanks for listening. And if you like this content, I hope you will like this video, comment on this video, share this video, and click subscribe and the bell to be notified when I make another video. That's the video.